Welcome, everyone. My name is Heather Hines. I'm the Interim Community Development Director for the city, and really pleased to be here tonight with a variety of staff members and consultants here to talk to you about the housing element process. So this is really a key component of our general plan update, and as we've called it, Housing Element 101, to kind of talk about from the basics to the more specifics, and then we will be breaking up into groups to have some more kind of intimate discussions about things related to housing. So thank you again for being here. I am going to turn it over to my colleagues and take you through a presentation that we hope you will enjoy and will be illuminating. So Ron, am I handing it over to you or Christina?
You're handing it over to me.
Okay, thank you.
And Eric, if you wouldn't mind making Ron a co-host, that would be awesome. I asked him to unmute, but I think he's just hanging out for a little minute. So before we get started, we have some logistics to cover. Hi, everybody. I am Christina, one of the planners with the city of Petaluma, and we are really looking forward to chatting with you this evening about housing. Before we get started with that, we have a couple of translators with us, Maria Galvez and Monica Aparico. And I believe that Monica is going to start us off and talk about how the translation and interpretation works.
Yes, good afternoon. We will be the translators for this evening, my colleague Maria Galvez and I. And we would like to go on and explain in Spanish for those requiring Spanish interpretation, how to access the interpretation channel. So I'll go into that right now. Para las personas que necesiten la traducción a interpretación en español, en la parte de abajo de su pantalla donde ve el icono de interpretación como se ve ahí como un globo, presione ahí, elija selección de idiomas y elija español. Puede ser también que en lugar de eso tenga 3 puntitos, también puede presionar los 3 puntitos y de ahí sale selección de idiomas, interpretación y en español. Gracias. Thank you. And
Right.
can we please be designated as interpreters now so we can start?
Yes, and thank you too so much for being here. I do want to note that folks who are participating in Spanish are very welcome to join in the conversation through the interpreter. They can help ask questions back and forth. I also want to note that closed caption is available for folks who would like to use that. And if you experience any technical difficulties, you can email Eric at this email here or send him a text, or you can send Maria an email and we can help you make sure that you can navigate the meeting. I am going to walk us through our agenda for this evening. First, we're going to do a presentation and then break out into small groups to have a conversation and come back as a larger group to wrap up. I'm noticing that folks are coming into the waiting room, so if somebody could keep an eye on that, it would be awesome to let folks in as they appear. We have this meeting scheduled to run until about 8 o'clock. So thanks so much for being with us again. So we are away. I will start diving into the presentation. The housing element that we are here to discuss tonight is part of the general plan, and we're going to get into more detail about what the housing element is specifically, but it's helpful to take a broad view of the general plan and the process that the city is going through right now. We are updating the general plan and the housing element together. We have just wrapped up the visioning phase of our general plan and are initiating the housing element. The housing element is going to wrap up a little bit before the completion of the general plan because we have some statutory requirements around the housing element. With the general plan itself, we are coming into the alternatives phase where we start to think about different scenarios for the development of the city. Then we're going to develop policies to shape those scenarios, the preferred scenario, and help to make sure that that is implementable. So what is a housing element? We are, again, going to get into this in a lot more detail. Ron's going to give you all of the download that you need, but just from a very broad perspective, the housing element is a required part of the general plan. We call them elements. You could also call them a chapter. The housing element is unique out of all of the elements in that it is very closely regulated by the State Department of Housing and Community Development. We are required to update our housing element at least once every 8 years. The whole Bay Area and the whole state of California are on 8-year cycles. The housing element needs to be approved by the folks at HCD, Housing and Community Development. It's adopted by City Council, and it's an opportunity for us to address local housing challenges. What I'm going to point out in this slide is that while we're on this 8-year time frame and we are updating our current housing element, we are also, as part of the general plan process, thinking on a longer term time frame about what we want to see in terms of housing in our city over the next 20 to 30 years. So for example, if we have a general plan that lasts about 24 years, we'd see 3 housing elements during that time. So this is an opportunity to give a lot of feedback into this first, the 6th cycle housing element. We're currently in the 5th cycle, but that's the one that's current right now. But the opportunity to talk about housing will not be over when we're done with this housing element. And if you have any questions about any of this, we're going to talk about it more when we get into breakout rooms. And I want to note that we're going to go through some live polling, and David is going to walk us through that. And then we'll be back with more details.
Hi, everyone. My name is David Garcia. I'm an associate planner for the city of Petaluma, and we're going to work together on some live polling. So before we jump into it, I want to note that all of this live polling is voluntary and anonymous. So just keep that in mind. We'll be using a platform called Mentimeter. So if this is your first time using it, hopefully it's going to be a fun way to provide some input. Christina, if you can go to the next slide, please. So for Mentimeter, we suggest opening another browser window, or if you have a cell phone or another laptop, tablet nearby, opening up a tab to get to www.mentimeter.com and entering the code that's specific for this meeting of 90651905. Another way, if you're doing this on your phone, you can scan this QR code by taking a picture to get to the survey questions that we're going to be going through together and seeing your feedback live on the screen.
And I am sorry, we're going through a little bit of a different process because Ron's computer was too hot. So I need to stop sharing right now, and I'm going to let Ron take it away so that you can share the Menti.
Excellent. And here we have that QR code up again, along with the code. Once you get to Mentimeter or menti.com, 90651905. So we'll give people a moment to pull that up. And I think we can move on. So while people are logging on, we're going to have a quick icebreaker with this question about what superpower would you most like to have? So we have 5 options here. And as we can see, as you're responding to the question, we see your responses live go onto the screen. So we have so far 8 participants. Thank you so much for logging in. Seems like we're on 2 different poles of being able to fly and talking to animals. This question definitely makes me think of the movie Encanto, if anyone watched that. So maybe some people were inspired by that talk to animals. Anyone else? We can go ahead and move on. So this question describes why you decided to come to tonight's workshop. So we're getting to know each other. We want to know if you live in Petaluma, if you work in Petaluma, if you own a business or property in the city, because you want to know about the housing element or future development in the city or some other idea. So remember, you can put all that apply. And thank you so much. So we see a few people who live here. We have some people who want to know more about the housing element and development, some workers, and some other reasons that we'll hopefully get into during our breakout sessions, where we're going to break out into smaller communities and be able to share a little bit more about what we're doing here and our own backgrounds. Thank you so much. Great, so this is a question to get a sense of who is represented, what parts of the city. So we have this divided into these 4 quadrants. So if you can take a moment and let us know what part of the city you're living in right now or think represents you. Excellent. So we got some strong Southwest representation, but also some representation from other parts. Excellent. Thank you so much. And moving on, now we want to know, especially related to our topic, do you rent or own your home, to get a sense of who's being represented here? And thank you so much. We see slightly more renters than we have owners. Thank you. And with that, we can move on. And this just asks you, what type of housing do you live in, to give a sense of, do you live in a single family home, maybe a mobile home, an ADU, and we see a duplex inhabitant coming up. Thank you. But we see the majority of people living in single family homes. See those snowballs continuing to go that way. And if we move on to this big question, we know this is a big, hard to answer question in any way, but we want to know from you just what jumps to the top of your mind of what is working well with housing in Petaluma. So what do you really appreciate about housing in Petaluma that you want to put out there? This is going to populate a word cloud. So we're going to get a sense of maybe some themes that are coming out from different community members. So we already see some great ones, historical, we got some charm, some aesthetics. It's always interesting to see which of these terms other people get inspired by and start repeating. So we see that historic jumping out, staying center, but we also see unique homes, very well maintained, beautiful housing, diversity or diverse. Yeah, this point about neighborhoods, but also the reality of property values, the mix that we have around Petaluma. Excellent. So with that, I think we can move on. We'll get into this all much deeper in further conversation. And this next question, I think, might be even harder to answer in a Menti poll, but it is, what housing issues or challenges need to be addressed? So what are some of the big issues that you've identified in your own experience in Petaluma that you want to make top of mind as we start this conversation today? Ooh, affordability came in big. Lack of low-income housing, availability, this idea of being too expensive, another way to emphasize the affordability issue, the lack of non-single family homes, of more diverse housing options. This one seems to be populating faster. It just seems to be growing even bigger as we're talking. So thank you so much for bringing up these big issues. It definitely adds to our conversation, and we're going to continue this as we're talking about what we've heard so far. We've already heard a lot about housing, so Ron, we can switch over to the slide deck. Thank you. So if we move on to the next slide, Christina already mentioned that we went through our big picture schedule that we're working on for the full general plan. And we've wrapped up the discovery phases or the visioning phases. And we just want to reiterate that these phases really helped us build a foundation for the general plan process, built through extensive research and, most importantly, outreach and community engagement with you. So to learn more about all of this information that we have, please access our website where you can find our existing conditions reports, summaries of various community engagement events and input that we've received, some links to the final drafts of the vision, pillars, and guiding principles, and much more. And you can also sign up to receive updates and meeting reminders for upcoming sessions. So with that, and emphasizing the input that we've received so far, we all know that housing is essential and impacts so many parts of our well-being and opportunities that we can access, and also our sense of security, just feeling safe. So throughout our varied community engagement events in the whole general plan process, which are listed here from surveys to meetings and pop-ups, the community really emphasized that housing is a critical priority. And we also received important input about the locations and type of future housing, along with other considerations about how we consider this in our larger ecosystem. Next, I'll review some of the larger themes and community priorities that we've heard so far and how they were reflected in the vision, pillars, and guiding principles. So if we look at these, this quite extensive list, I want to summarize these by saying that Petaluma prioritizes these three themes for housing: equity, environmental health, and thoughtful densification. So Petaluma centers the needs of unhoused communities and wants accessible and affordable housing that meets the needs of families, seniors, and many others. Petalumans prioritize climate action and want housing to help us achieve carbon neutrality by 2030 and respect the larger ecosystem which we are stewarding. And finally, Petalumans identified the need to densify thoughtfully and place housing near our existing resources, respecting our sense of place, and consider the different types of housing needed to meet our different communities' needs. And this next slide is just an example of how specific the conversations we're getting in terms of geographic parts of the city. So this map that we used at one of our neighborhood meetings shows, depending on different parts of the city, what type of housing they wanted to see and what types of densities. So for example, area P, that's near Adobe Creek, community members identified lower density housing of 1 to 4 units that you can see in the bar graph in this darker orange, while in the downtown areas, we see this need for apartments and condos. So that's just to give you a little taste of that. And moving on, in our vision statement, pillars and principles, our GPAC really articulated the future that we want to create in Petaluma. So the most relevant for our housing conversation from our vision statement is that we want to have plentiful and varied housing options, but we also must prioritize supporting communities most affected by injustice and inequity and act boldly to do this. And finally, we must provide balanced housing types and promote affordability and diverse housing throughout the city. And just in case you were wondering, the best timing for sharing your perspective on the housing element and on housing in general is now. So we're here tonight and we're going to continue to have other opportunities to do this. We have a few members of our GPAC Housing Working Group, led by Ali Gaylord, Dave Alden, Chris Rebelo, Janice Cater-Thompson. Thank you so much for being here. And if you want to participate, please email aligaylord@gmail.com. Throughout the summer, we'll have another public review of the draft housing element, or we'll have a public review of the draft housing element once we have it. We'll have an open house around that, as well as our ongoing general plan work. So with that, now I'll pass it on to Ron to talk specifically about the nuts and bolts of the housing element update.
Thank you, David, and thank you, Christina and Heather, and good evening, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight. Our primary goal tonight is to hear from you, not to make you housing experts necessarily, but it is helpful for you to have a basic understanding of housing elements so that you understand how your input tonight will inform the planning process. So with that in mind, I'm going to cover some basic housing element facts, introduce the major components or building blocks or components of the housing element, the final product, and then some of the building blocks that we use to develop a housing element. And then finally, spend a bit more time on one of those building blocks, the infamous RHNA, Regional Housing Needs Allocation and Site Inventory Methodology. We'll then have one more round of live polling and spend the second half of the workshop tonight hearing your thoughts in small groups. Christina touched on some of this, so I'll be brief. The housing element is unique among the required elements or chapters of the general plan. It's unique in that it has a near-term focus. It works on 8-year cycles, whereas most general plan efforts are much more long-range in focus, 20 to 30 years. It's also unique in that it has a statutory deadline associated with those 8-year planning cycles, and also unique in that it's the only element that requires any level of state certification, in this case, certification by the Department of Housing and Community Development. Another major difference is the state's increasing focus on accountability, specifically with housing elements. So there are consequences associated with completing an HCD certified housing element on time. Some of those are legal, some have to do with local control of future housing decisions, and some are financial. There's a mix of carrots and sticks on the financial side. Cities who stay in compliance are eligible for additional funding sources to advance housing goals. Those who do not stay in compliance lose access to some of those funds and could even be subject to financial penalties. So in simple terms, housing elements really just have two parts. One is to identify adequate housing sites to accommodate the regional housing need allocation, which I'll explain in more detail in a few minutes. The other major component is the housing element is the strategies to advance housing production and equity. In general terms, those are policies and programs that focus on a variety of areas, including housing preservation, housing production, and fair housing. One other note about the housing element update that we know is on lots of people's minds, specifically the question, why is the city building more housing if there isn't enough water? Unfortunately, the simple answer is that state law requires it. The city must, on the one hand, demonstrate that it can accommodate future housing needs. And it must also demonstrate that it has sufficient infrastructure to support that level of housing development, including water. That being said, both the general plan and the updated urban water management plan prepare for future water needs, including source development, efficiency measures, and conservation. In the near term, the city is advancing a number of water conservation strategies and updating its water plan. I'll now give you a very short overview of the analysis that informs the housing element update. So to prepare those two major building blocks, the strategies and the sites, two major components, a number of building blocks are used. 4 of these directly inform housing strategy development. So far for Petaluma, we've been focusing on 3, reviewing socioeconomic data compiled during the discovery phase of the general plan update to confirm housing needs, reviewing existing housing programs, and examining constraints on housing production. Affirmatively furthering fair housing, or AFFH, is a new, more robust analysis required in the 6th cycle housing elements, which is done later and builds on the other building blocks. The final building block on this slide is a site inventory, and I'll talk more about that in a few minutes. Planning team has been working on these components in preparation for housing element community engagement like tonight, and the preliminary analysis helps us focus your input on questions that need the most community direction. So first building block, the needs assessment. The purpose of this is to analyze housing needs and describe resources available to address them. We seek to understand the highest needs in order to plan for the housing required to meet them. So for example, we know from housing trend analysis that Petaluma's population is aging, and we need to make sure we accommodate that with future housing. We also know, as you also obviously are tracking on, that more affordable housing is needed. A significant proportion of the community is cost burden, which is defined as spending more than 30% of your income on housing. And we know that more housing choices and types of sizes and modes are needed in the community to accommodate a variety of needs and household types. Related but distinct from the housing needs assessment is the AFFH requirement. With the 6th cycle, much more thorough review is required, and that includes a review of existing housing, fair housing enforcement and capacity to assess fair housing. It also builds on the housing needs assessment and additional fair housing analysis tools to analyze citywide trends, and also looks at the site inventory from a affirmatively furthering fair housing lens. And based on all that, the housing element then must identify and prioritize contributing factors to fair housing issues and include meaningful goals and actions to advance fair housing. The third building block is the constraints analysis, and it considers both actual and potential governmental constraints to housing development, including land use controls, permit procedures, improvement requirements, and fees. It also considers potential and actual non-governmental constraints like sensitive environmental areas, hazards, costs, and financing. Another major building block of the housing element is the housing site inventory. I know there's a lot of interest in this, so I'll spend a bit more time introducing the methodology. You've likely heard of RHNA, or Regional Housing Needs Allocation. It is determined by the state and the region's Council of Government, in this case, ABAG, or Association of Bay Area Governments for Petaluma. Petaluma's final RHNA for the 6th cycle is broken down by income category on this slide. In the inventory, Petaluma must demonstrate that it has adequate housing sites for those 1,910 units by income level. In other words, it is about capacity to accommodate housing with existing zoning, and you have a zoning map on the right-hand side of this slide. It is not, however, the proactive identification of where housing will or should be built. We can't emphasize this point enough, so more specifically, state law does not require that jurisdictions build or finance the new housing in the inventory. The inventory does not control when or how much housing is actually built or require anything of property owners. Residential development is not limited to those sites in the site inventory, and even land that is not currently zoned for housing could still be rezoned in the future for housing. The site inventory does not control that sort of thing. And then, as we all know, new housing construction is based on a variety of socioeconomic factors, such as demand, financing, construction costs, and is ultimately driven by the housing market. We know there's a lot of interest, so I'm going to talk through at a high level and really quickly the 5 steps in the methodology. First, we identify likely housing sites in production, then look for additional opportunity sites for housing. We evaluate those sites, see where we're at in terms of projected build out relative to the RHNA, and then repeat as needed to confirm the city has adequate capacity. The first 2 steps really are all about identifying the pool of likely housing development in the next 8 years. First, we go with the lowest hanging fruit. We're able to develop trends based on the last 3 years of housing development with ADUs and use those same trends projecting out over the next 8 years. Likewise, we work from the city's existing list, as seen on the slide here, of pipeline projects, and assume that those will be built when as appropriate in the next 8 years. So we count for all those assumed to be built units. We then also, in step 2, identify other sites that are candidates. This could be a variety of opportunity sites, some of which come from the 5th cycle inventory. However, we do not wholesale assume all 5th cycle sites will be reused. We reevaluate them as part of the process. We also identify other sites of interest, either by a demonstrated landowner or developer interest, or other areas that city staff are familiar with where they think it's likely that housing will be built. Next, we carefully evaluate and analyze sites through a variety of means, some analytical and technical with GIS, others based on simple site visits, and consider a wide range of criteria and factors to consider the suitability of all the candidate sites. And in these next slides, I'm just going to give you a few snapshots of the types of factors or screens that we can use and have been using to evaluate potential sites. So one set of screens is areas that we want to avoid future housing being placed in. And here's an example of known hazards, both wildfire and projected flood and sea level rise. Another thing to consider is where there's differences in opportunity and vulnerability across the community. Want to make sure there's a diversity of housing options and affordability options within more vulnerable communities, and make sure they also have the other amenities and services that are needed to complement housing that's built in those areas. Likewise, we want to ensure that housing is near good transit, as well as accessible to parks and other public amenities. And then also consider other factors like the quality of the tree canopy. Make sure a variety of affordability levels and housing types are available throughout the city, including where the tree canopy is strongest. And then at the same time, we should note that the GP, through other elements, addresses some of these issues as well and works hard to provide an equitable distribution of access of services, both public and private, across the city to accommodate all community members' needs. Another final example is access to community healthy food markets in this case. And all these maps, again, were from the discovery phase of the project and from the existing conditions reports. One final note, one thing we're also considering as part of the site inventory is sites that we shouldn't consider. One is sites where we know there's an ongoing community conversation and the appropriate use of certain sites is yet to be determined. The most obvious case for this is the fairgrounds. We know the city is undergoing a separate planning process for the fairgrounds. So for the 6th cycle, we are not considering including the fairground site in the site inventory. 4th step then is to see where we stand in terms of build out relative to RHNA. State law allows us to assume a maximum density of 70%. This can be modified as needed based on recent trends by area. And then also each parcel is categorized by income category. In this case, the state uses a proxy of density to categorize areas that are zoned for 20 units or more per acre for low income and the rest as moderate or higher. And finally, we repeat those processes as necessary to make sure that the city has the most appropriate set of sites in its inventory, demonstrating it has capacity to build enough housing to meet its RHNA targets by the end of the planning cycle. We're still preparing the site inventory, so we don't yet know whether rezoning will be required. You only rezone in the case where your current zoning does not accommodate enough housing to meet the RHNA. We don't know yet whether that's the case for Petaluma. If that turns out to be the case, we'll be sure to come back to the community for guidance and work closely with the Planning Commission and the GPAC to make determinations around where change in land use is most appropriate.
Ron, can you slow down just a little bit for the interpretation, please?
Oh, I'm sorry.
That's okay.
I'm trying to actually speed up. I apologize, interpreters. I'm trying to work through this so we can get into a small group conversation. Sorry, interpreters.
Well, thank you so much for that, Ron. I know it was very detailed, but it's been really fun to be working on that all over these past few months. So we're going back to our Mentimeter. So we're going to, again, return to our phone or other browser window. And if you could please go to www.menti.com and enter the code 90651905 or scan the QR code. And we'll give people a moment to do that. And now we're back in the Mentimeter. So another big question to see what is top of mind about where we should put housing is completing the sentence. Future housing should be near ... What are the big things that come to your mind about our future housing in Petaluma that we should consider as we work on our site inventory? So we have transit, walkable spaces, some other active transportation spaces, also public transit, services, be close to downtown or in downtown, close to parks, close to healthy foods, walkable. Excellent. Thank you so much for these contributions, definitely resonating with what we've heard so far. Also a quick plug for the East Side. Thank you so much. Grocery stores. Thank you. And if we can move on to the next slide. Now, the opposite. What should future housing be kept away from? What should we be avoiding while planning for the future of housing in Petaluma? Also, not an easy question or an easy question, depending on how you look at it, but definitely a big thing that we are thinking about throughout this process. We see the floodplain, we see habitats, wildfire. We see also the Petaluma River, noting our urban growth boundary and avoiding the urban fringe and industrial areas. Definitely keeping away from environmentally sensitive areas and wildlife corridors. Making note that we want to stay out of our green fields and other areas where other plants and animals inhabit. Excellent. Thank you so much for this input. And moving on, now that we've gotten to know each other a little bit better and our ideas, we want to know a little bit more about you all. We want to know who's in the room, our different age brackets. So we have some people from 25 to 44, some people 55 and older. It's interesting that staying in those two columns. Any 45 to 54-year-olds in the crowd or anyone under 24? Okay, we definitely will work on connecting with our youth more in the future. Thank you so much for this input. And also, whatever race and ethnicity you identify with, you can select more than one. Excellent. Thank you so much for responding to that question. It definitely helps us understand who's in the room and who's not in the room. And finally, this question about our annual household income, just a reminder that these are completely anonymous. We know that these are questions that might be a little bit hard to answer, but it definitely helps us understand, again, who is being represented and who we need to continue to outreach to. Excellent. Thank you all so much. And with that, that's our final Menti poll. Just really appreciate all the participation and helping us out with understanding things that are on your mind and who's in the room. And with that, I'll hand it over to Christina.
Great, thanks so much, David. And I am going to begin mentally transitioning us into our breakout rooms by giving us some food for thought for those sessions. So on the next slide, what Ron mentioned is that, and Ron, I think that you are advancing slides, so could you, thank you. What Ron mentioned as one of the 5th building blocks of a housing element is an evaluation of the progress and appropriateness of the policies in our current 5th cycle housing element. So our housing element is arranges its policies into the 10 goals that you can see here. And one of the things that we're going through is evaluating these to see if we want to keep them or tweak them or get rid of them, as well as potentially add new policies that we want to move forward with. So when we want to wrap our brains around this, on the next slide, you can see some what we're calling buckets or categories of kinds of policies. So, you know, we think of the housing element as where should housing go? And that's an important part of it. But an almost equally important part is how do we do it? How do we support great housing? How do we support the functioning of existing housing? And those are the policies that are in the housing element. So we are proposing that we talk about these 6 buckets of policies. That includes homelessness, how to mitigate homelessness and help folks be housed, anti-displacement, and how to keep people in their housing, fair housing, how to make sure we are providing housing for all areas of the community, diverse housing production, how do we build all different kinds of houses, again, so that we can support quite a few different folks and different needs. Homeownership, this can be really important for folks and important for their economic stability. How can we provide opportunities to buy homes at a range of prices? And then housing preservation. How do we make sure that we keep great housing or functional housing, and particularly affordable housing in existence rather than taking it out? So we looked through the existing housing element, the 5th cycle housing element, and we saw that we had policies in 5 of those bucket areas, and you can see those here. And if you want to dig into them more, these are all going to be listed in our materials for the breakout rooms. But we looked at homelessness, anti-displacement, fair housing, diverse housing production, homeownership in the last element. And then we, as a planning team, we got together, we took all the ideas that we heard from folks in outreach that we've been describing and got some great feedback from our consultants who are helping us out. And we did a brainstorm, like what could we do? What are some best practices or some really interesting things that other cities are doing? And here you have a list of those in similar buckets. And we're going to be able to talk about whether or not you guys think these are great ideas, whether you have other ideas, if you have any questions about how these policies might work. We're going to talk about that in our breakout rooms. But just to grab a couple, we're thinking about fair housing. Can we register landlords so that we can reach out through them to make sure everything's going well and that folks are being treated fairly? As one example, I'm just scanning through. What about amnesty for illegal ADUs? If somebody has converted their garage into a unit, can we work with them to make sure that that unit is safe and may continue to be available, because that's a really affordable form of housing. So we can dig into that more in our chats that we're going to have in just a minute. And you can ask your facilitator, a little bit more about any of those you're curious about. All right, so Ron is going to escort us into our breakout rooms, and we will see you all in a little bit.
Yes, thank you, Christina. And yes, now we're excited to break into small groups so that we can hear your thoughts directly and get you engaged in creative conversation to generate all kinds of new ideas to inform the housing element. So again, we're going to be focusing on these 2 questions. So your input with the polls tonight will help the planning team, but we're also very interested in your ideas around heights. Sometimes city increase allowable heights to allow for more housing where it's desired and or more affordable housing in certain areas. So we're very interested in folks ideas about where it might be appropriate to change the height limitations around the city. Likewise, as Christina just explained, really, really interested in people's ideas for how to achieve these community goals. What do you think should be done? What do you think the city can do? What do you think it can do with its partners to make sure we're providing everybody in the community the housing that they want and need? So we'll be using the Zoom breakout format. And in a minute, Eric, our host, will be breaking us into breakout groups in a random way. I think we're going to have just 3 rooms total. A third will stay in the main room, and then we'll distribute folks into 2 additional rooms. We'll have about 40 minutes, I think. So it'll be about 20 minutes per part, and I'll explain the 2 parts here in a second. It's really around heights and then around specific actions to take. We're going to be using Miro, which is an online whiteboarding software, and you see an example of that here in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. You'll have both a facilitator and a note taker in your room to support the conversation. And we invite you to share your comments verbally. The recorder will be capturing those comments on the whiteboard. You'll see them as the notes are being taken. But as a backup, we'll also be recording the sections in case we need to review them to confirm we've heard correctly what people had to say. We're going to come back together as a group at about 7:40 or so, because we'd like to give everybody an opportunity to hear what the other groups talked about. So just as a refresher, in case you haven't been on enough Zoom meetings already, there's the mute button is in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen where you can mute and unmute yourself, or if you're calling in by phone, press *6. Likewise, if you'd like to make a contribution so that we can keep it manageable for the facilitator, we ask that you use the raise hand function, which either can be accessed through the participant window or in the reactions button at the bottom of your Zoom panel. And if you're again calling in by phone, also our Spanish interpretation channel, stay in the main room. You may get randomly distributed to another room, in which case you just press the button at the bottom of your screen to leave that breakout room. It'll then automatically send you back to the main room where the interpreters will remain, and you'll continue to be able to both hear what's being shared in Spanish and contribute in Spanish if you would like. Okay, so with that, Eric, are you ready to break us into the 3 groups?
Yes, I am. And just to confirm, I have 3 breakout rooms, including the main room. Do we want to eliminate one of those rooms and have it be 2 breakout rooms plus the main room?
Yes, 3 rooms total, please, Eric, would be amazing. Thank you.
3 rooms
so much.
total. Okay,
Yeah.
I'll delete the 3rd room then here.
So whenever you're ready, Eric, you can go ahead and randomly distribute folks. So I stopped sharing screen on purpose because I thought it'd be useful just to see each other as we're hearing about what people discussed in their small groups. Are we all back now, Eric? Can you give me a thumbs up if we are? Thank you. So what we'd like to do now for each of the 3 groups, just have someone from the group share some of the highlights and themes of what people shared and discussed during those groups. I would normally put myself on first order of business to provide an example, but quite frankly, we had so many interesting, diverse ideas shared in my group. I haven't yet got my head around the mix of them. But I will start and give the other groups a minute to get your thoughts together. And I'm not going to be comprehensive by any means, but on the heights question specifically, we actually had some really good comments around, it's not just height and height is important, but really, local context is really important. It's hard to speak in general terms about what heights are appropriate. You really need to think about context and be thoughtful about, even when you're allowing additional height, that you build into the development standards, appropriate transitions from what might be newer, higher buildings next to what historically are lower level buildings. Also, a lot of comments about design. It's not just height, there's other design considerations as well. We noted in our group that the city's in the process of updating its objective design standards, which speak to some of those issues specifically. And that's an opportunity to help inform how future development looks and feels and the form of it on each lot and in each area. And then I guess one final thought I'll share is just an interesting discussion around adaptive reuse of current non-residential areas and what that might also mean in terms of height. So if you've got an existing low-level commercial area where there's room to integrate housing on maybe some unused parking space on the same spot, how would you handle that relative in terms of both heights, but then also the transition and accommodation of the mix of uses on that site? So just a small sampling of a variety of issues that our group considered as part of the height conversation. Had an equally robust conversation around kind of what the city could do. Everything from, making sure that we're accommodating the housing needs of workers as the economy continues to grow in Petaluma, including the addition of new employers that may create additional housing need and making sure that the workers can live and live and work in Petaluma. Lots of interesting ideas again about the how. Let's not displace things that we value or change things that we value about the community by adding more housing. For instance, let's not only make sure new housing has plenty of greenery integrated into it, but make sure it doesn't displace existing green spaces. And that people have access to green spaces, both in their immediate housing development, but also within close to their home, access to parks and other related amenities. Let's see, I know I'm missing lots of points here. Let's see. Oh, one other quick thought about just like thinking about different types of places for future housing. Talked about institutional places, churches, as appropriate. People see those as great opportunities where there's lots of open space. It's not regularly used to integrate more housing, especially if it's in areas that are close to places people go on a regular basis or their jobs or whatnot. So I'll stop there. There were a ton of other ideas shared. As we noted earlier, we'll be sure to integrate and organize and compile all this and summarize in a report. And so the input has been extremely valuable. Really appreciate your time. So I don't know who ended up being the facilitators in the other group. Was it Heather and Christina? I don't know which of you are ready to share highlights from your conversation.
I can hop in. So in terms of the conversation with height, there was kind of a mix about, especially in the downtown smart station, kind of like 2 to 6. That first some input kind of like we could go taller, but then we had a really key comment about the embodied carbon costs of buildings. And we happen to have the lovely Ann Edminster in our group, and she always adds these amazing tidbits of information that makes you think of things a little bit differently. And a lot of the research being that 4 to 6 stories is really the sweet spot with embodied carbon. So in that, you probably don't want to be looking at buildings much more than 6, but maybe 2 in that area isn't quite tall enough. So to be thinking about it through that lens, and really an acknowledgement that some of those key corridors like Washington or McDowell, that the 2-story kind of more strip mall type suburban commercial that is along those really doesn't give you a great sense of place, doesn't make you want to linger or hang out. And so that those areas are areas that seeing more height could be beneficial to both, meet our housing needs, but also meet some of our other community character, mobility, some of those things. We also talked about the downtown and the historic character and really wanting to be sensitive to that, wanting to preserve that, which doesn't necessarily mean no more height, but just being, particularly cautious, making sure that there's a variety so that you don't kind of get this, everything in the downtown is a straight 6 stories, that kind of thing. So looking at that cautiously, definitely some room to increase heights around the second smart station, if that's going to be our second smart station. Really, having a limit of 2 stories doesn't seem to make sense. And then as we move to talking about, kind of the housing program policies, focus on, looking at related things like food desert, tree protection, walkability, that those are all so important for successful housing projects. So that those should be part of the discussion. A great addition from Margaret about the just cause ordinance, tenants' rights, options to purchase, rental registry, some of those programs, and how important those are, and a kind of acknowledgement that she was really pleased to see Petaluma talking about those, not because somebody was just because somebody was bringing it up, but that we already were talking about those things. There was acknowledgement of that. We also talked about really only building the housing we need. And this kind of gets into our carbon neutrality goals, and how do we make sure we're not building market rate or above market rate that we don't really need just to get the few affordable inclusionary units. It's part of that. And so looking at tools, carbon budget, to really be thinking about all housing projects through that lens. And then also the importance of a public housing entity to really help us make that shift and to shepherd the type of housing we need, and not at the expense of using our land for housing we don't need. And I think that's a general overview of what we talked about in group 1. Christina.
Thank you. Sounds like a great group. Yeah, thank you, Christina.
Thank you. We had an amazing group also. And we talked about a lot of sort of similar ideas in terms of heights. We had folks, generally feeling like it was a good idea to encourage additional density. In some cases not everybody had the same thoughts, and there was a focus on wanting to make sure that the urban form was really bikeable and walkable, and that folks could get from one place to another, and without a lot of traffic, but also wanting to preserve that sense of openness, to preserve green space, and that kind of thing. And then once we got into the policies, we had a great discussion about ADUs and the importance of the city streamlining and supporting that project, that process. And this fact that the city is working to do permit ready ADUs and make that easier. We also looked at supporting workforce housing, incentivizing inclusionary housing, and really not welcoming in lieu fees to make sure that affordable housing is integrated into the fabric of the city, rather than having piecemeal affordable housing projects in a variety of places. In terms of housing the whole community, we heard support for a treehouse model, for intergenerational housing, for supporting aging in place, making sure to house foster children, and workforce housing I mentioned. Let's see, what else did we cover? Some folks were really interested in the parcel that is between the river and the highway, where you would get if you took Rainier under the highway, and what could potentially happen there outside of the floodplain. Is that a spot for homeless housing, or a little village, or what could potentially happen down there? And folks were wanting to support the end house and focus on community development. Let's see, Aaron or Mike or Lillian, are there any things that you want to add to my summary?
You got it all.
All right. Thank you, group. It was great.
Okay, I think we're now coming to the end of tonight's session. I want to personally thank everybody again for joining us tonight. Christina, would you like to close us out?
Sure. So we went through a few of these points. Either we would love for you to remain engaged and really thank folks who have been engaged throughout the process and new people. You see here a way to get in touch with Ali Gaylord if you want to work with the GPAC housing group. We're going to continue to be holding community events both on housing specifically and on the general plan more broadly. And again, I have to say we have a really good website. There is a lot of information on the general plan website. You can get in touch with us through that. You can sign up for a mailing so that you find out everything that's going on. And you can really dig into the details on any of the topics that we have covered here tonight. So thank you so much for joining us, and let us know, send us emails or other ideas as they arise.
And can we just add that that's planpetaluma.org is the general plan website.
Planpetaluma.org.
And I'll just say again, thank you to everyone for being here tonight. It was a small but mighty group to talk about housing. So thank you, thank you, thank you. We really appreciate your time. We know that everyone has other things in their lives that maybe are calling them. So the fact that you chose to spend the evening with us means a lot, and we look forward to continuing to engage with you through this process. Anything else that we need to cover? Okay, everyone go eat dinner. Enjoy your evening. We'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.